Hello Math 152 students. In this video, we're going to take a look at some midterm frequently asked questions and then also some study tips. The first place I want to direct your attention to is the midterm information post that was posted last week. Some of the questions I've been getting this week are addressed in this post, particularly questions about StatCrunch and books and notes. You are allowed to use StatCrunch, but books and notes are not allowed, as specified in point 3. Also, as far as formulas, a lot of the work that you're going to be doing is StatCrunch based. So I'm not going to be providing standard deviation by hand formulas because you will be allowed to use StatCrunch. You will have the z-score formula, which we're going to be utilizing later in the course. So if you don't have that one memorized, it will be on there. And then anything else that you might need, such as a deck of cards or some situation for probability that's unfamiliar, I would provide a context for you there. But everything else you need to come prepared with. So as we look at some topics, hopefully that'll trigger some things for you to make notes of, such as empirical rule or definitions that you might not have committed to memory. One other thing that is a little different, this was updated in an announcement this week, is the midterm is actually scheduled to start at noon instead of 1 p.m. On the course schedule that was put out at the beginning of the semester, they have 1 to 8, but we're actually starting that at noon to give you an extra hour. You want to make sure you plan to finish by 8 o'clock, not start by 8 o'clock. The exams will end at 8. Lastly, as we look at some topics, we'll notice that some of the questions lend themselves nicely to multiple choice, short answer, or explanations. So you want to think about a mix of those sorts of problems. So let's take a look at kind of a list of topics. This is not meant to be exhaustive. It doesn't cover every single thing that's in Chapter 1, Chapter 2, 3, 4, and 5. It's more of a reminder of different important topics for you to go back and look at. So Chapter 1, the biggest thing you want to focus on is vocabulary. Chapter 1 is very well suited to multiple choice type questions when we're dealing with variables and identifying them as qualitative versus quantitative, discrete versus continuous, their level of measurements. Also things such as a scenario and deciding which sampling method we're looking at. Deciding between cluster and stratified, or if we're given a scenario, deciding if it's an observational study or experiment. If it's observational study, what type, such as cohort or cross-sectional. So those sorts of things, expect multiple choice type evaluations. For Chapter 2, you want to make sure you focus on understanding the different types of charts and graphs. For example, if I ask you to create a frequency distribution, you want to make sure you understand that a frequency distribution is a table, it's a tally chart, and that's different than a frequency histogram, which is a graph displaying similar information. Anytime you're creating a chart and a graph, you could use StatCrunch, like type the data in, use StatCrunch to create your chart. You could also do it by hand. You're not going to have extremely large data sets on your midterm, so either one is feasible. Creating a tally chart or a histogram from a small data set, or inputting those values into StatCrunch, creating a chart and graph, and copying that onto your paper. You also want to focus on just interpreting a chart and a graph, answering just basic questions such as calculating percents or making a judgment based on a chart or graph. Shape of the distribution, something we'll see in Chapter 3 as well, as we looked at histograms in more depth, and also box plots. So making sure you can look at a picture and decide, is this skewed right, skewed left, uniform, is it bell-shaped? Chapter 3 lends itself very well to short answer calculations, but also some explanations. One thing I wanted to highlight at the beginning is some of our more familiar topics like mean versus median. Most likely you came into the course understanding the difference between the two, but we threw some vocabulary in 3.1 such as resistance and maybe thought about some of these terms in different ways. So as you're going back, I just highlighted 3 problems on page 119 from your book to go back and think about applying your knowledge to now, making sure you can use appropriate vocabulary. So understanding the difference between when you would use the mean versus the median, not just how to calculate the mean and how to calculate the median. So as far as other big topics, we discussed standard deviation and variance, making sure you can use StatCrunch to find those. Then empirical rule. You do want to know the percentages described in the empirical rule, that's 68, 95, 99.7, and how to use the normal curve to break up those percentages and answer questions. So if you have an empirical rule question, we'll provide a blank bell-shaped curve, but you will need to provide the breakdown of the percentages. For the grouped data, this was section 3.3, you want to make sure you can use StatCrunch to calculate the mean and standard deviation. It's also possible to do the mean rather quickly by hand, but again, here, StatCrunch, especially if you're doing standard deviation. Z-scores are another big topic that we'll see later in chapter 7 and 8 very heavily. You want to make sure you understand how to interpret a z-score, and if you're calculating and comparing 2 z-scores, how to use 2 z-scores to make a decision. So we had questions like, here's 2 groups, 2 individuals. Which person is relatively larger or has a relatively larger score or a relatively smaller? You want to make sure you review examples where both z-scores are positive and both z-scores are negative. Similar to some of the ideas we saw in chapter 5 with positive and negative residuals, those positive and negatives are going to make a big impact on our interpretation. For quartiles, you want to make sure you can identify quartiles from a box plot, but also a 5-number summary, that you understand how to calculate the interquartile range and just basic range and interpret. And then being able to read those information pieces off a box plot, but also to see a box plot and to draw conclusions, kind of like when we were comparing the generic vitamin versus Centrum in your lab. So going on to chapter 4, I listed topics related to linear regression, and I didn't include a bullet point for tables in 4.4 because some of those we also saw in chapter 5. For chapter 4, you want to make sure you understand the difference between the R value and the regression equation. Some of these were getting mixed up on the labs just in terms of knowing what was being asked. So make sure you understand that the correlation coefficient is the same thing as the R value, and then also how to use that information to establish whether you have a linear relationship. If you are asked to establish this, we would provide a table of critical values. You wouldn't be expected to memorize those. For the linear regression equation, using StatCrunch to produce that, then making predictions, either interpolations or extrapolations, using predictions to then compare to the actual values to find residuals. And then these last 3 points for chapter 4, you can expect to have to write some sentences. So write a sentence interpreting slope. You want to make sure you review some problems that had positive slope and negative slope. Our lab example that was paired with our discussion board for chapter 4 was a positive slope. You should have some examples in your text and possibly your homework and chapter test with negative slope. Then for a y-intercept, you want to make sure you review some examples where the y-intercept had a good interpretation and made sense, and then some scenarios where it did not. So we saw both, where the y-intercept was outside the scope of the model and didn't have a reasonable interpretation. For interpreting r-squared, we didn't see this in the lab. I didn't stick that on there or in the discussion board, but you could interpret the r-squared value, which StatCrunch spits out for you, as a percentage interpretation. So make sure you go back and are able to write a sentence for those. For Chapter 5, I'm not going to ask you to write out probability rules like the formulas. You want to make sure that if I give you a context, you know how to calculate the probability. If you find it helpful to memorize some of those rules, great. If you find yourself just diving in and working the problem without actually writing out a formula, that's probably even better. So utilizing these probability rules to solve a probability question. So I broke up some of our categories. Some of your questions are or, some of them are and some of them are at least. In particular, I stuck several at least probabilities on your Chapter 5 discussion board because these ones tend to be the longest probability questions with the most number of steps. So make sure if you haven't checked that out to join in the discussion, making sure that you can kind of explain or follow the steps. Finally, tables. So similar to the tables we saw in Chapter 4, you can use tables to answer probabilities, and these actually work really well with some of the different probability types, but also conditional probability. So in summary, think about the beginning of the course, maybe more heavy on vocab and multiple choice, and then as we're progressing through the material, we sort of switch over to you producing the answers and responses and then interpreting some of those responses. So hopefully this is helpful in preparing for your midterm. If you have specific questions, remember you can use the Ask My Instructor button on your homework questions or send me the number on your test problems if you're running into something and not sure how to tackle it. All right, remember office hours online Wednesday. I'll be responding to your questions that come in, so certainly send those, and then I will either see you on Friday for the midterm. I'll be proctoring for one of those hours, or grading those after you're finished. As far as the grades for the midterm, I will send out an email when those grades are up, probably some time at the beginning of the next week. All right, so look for a couple more emails this week as we prepare, and I will talk to you guys soon.